Everyone and welcome. So we've got a great setup with some fabulous panelists today, but before we started I wanted to give you a quick bit of background. So I'm Kate McCoy, and along with Jess Crombie and Rachel Erskine, give us a little wave, I co-chair the People in the Pictures Bond working group. So the group was set up following some research of the same name that Jess worked on at Save the Children, which asks the people who appear in NGO comms and fundraising for their opinions on the content and their experiences of being involved. And if you haven't read it, I really recommend it. It had a really big impact on me, and I'll post a link in the chat shortly. So through the group, we've developed guidance on ethical approaches to gathering and using images and stories, and I'll also post the guidance because hopefully that will be useful if you haven't already seen it. And we try and promote discussion among content and creative leads across the sector. So with the recent focus on anti-racism, we felt it was really important to examine the impact that NGO comms and fundraising have on perceptions about race, and look at how we can make more of a positive contribution through the stories we tell. And we really wanted to hear and learn from people who are already doing important work in this area. So I'm really pleased to introduce our fantastic panel. So we've got Janice Njoroge, who's Communications Manager at AMREF Help Africa, Ivy Lahon, who's Head of Creative Content and Stories at Save the Children, and Natalie Larty, who's Communications and Advocacy Officer at IIED. So in a sec, they'll introduce themselves and talk a bit about their work, and then we'll have some discussion points with a chance for questions at the end. So if you've got any questions, please post them in the Q&A. There's a button at the bottom of the Zoom window where you can post questions. So we'll be monitoring that rather than the chat. And just to let you know, the webinar will also be recorded. And before we kick off, I just wanted to hand over to Jess quickly, who wanted to add something.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, hi everyone. Just a really quick kind of acknowledgement of the existence of white fragility and the way that when white people discuss race and racism, it can cause discomfort and feelings of defensiveness or guilt, or even, you know, that they just don't feel comfortable saying anything at all because of that issue. And I kind of wanted to acknowledge that the existence of white people having societal advantages at the top of this, and we're going to hear some of this from our panelists today, but also if you are white and feeling this way during the talk, please try to overcome those feelings and still ask the questions that you want to ask, because you might not get all the terminology right and you might not say it in the right way, but that's okay. We want to hear from you, and this is the safe space for you to ask all the things you are thinking about and all the ways you want to change your organisation and what you might do about those things. So please don't be silent or defensive. Please ask those questions and kind of enter into this in an open and willing way, which all our panelists are doing today. All right. It's a difficult thing to say, but I felt it was important. Thanks.
Thanks, Jess. So over to our panelists. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, Janice.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Kate. My name is Janice Njoroge, and I lead the communications function for AMREF Help Africa's country program in Kenya. And I am also fortunate to work with Rachel to co-chair our global website and social media working group that really focuses on bringing all our website and social media experts across the organization, because we have a presence in Africa and North America and Europe. So we come together and think through social media strategy for the organization, how we want our websites to look, what kind of information we want to share on those platforms. And we've learned quite a number of lessons around ensuring that we can give an authentic voice to the communities that we work with, and ensuring that the stories that we tell are a true reflection of the challenges that they're facing, but also the solutions that they have that are inherent and in line with the setting in which they live and work. So I hope to be sharing some of those insights with you this afternoon.
Thank you. Ivy, I think you've got some slides that you wanted to share with us.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks so much for having me, Kate, Jess and Rachel. So I thought it was useful just to put together some slides. Firstly, because I'm Ivy Lahon. I'm the Head of Creative Content and Stories at Save the Children UK, and my team there, quite a large team of multimedia producers, designers, picture editors, post-production technicians, and we basically deal with researching, finding the stories of the children and the families we work with, and then going out into the field and gathering those stories. And then once we have that raw material, then turning those into the final assets, which you would see across all of our kind of print and digital platforms. I think, is one of the slides, are the slides showing at the moment?
There we go, I think they've just started.
Great, thanks. So, if we could just go on to the next slide. So I wanted to just put this up here. So in June, our executive leadership team made a really bold public statement. It was at the height of kind of the Black Lives Matter protests. It was quite a long statement, which was basically a statement of solidarity, which looked at, in essence, kind of recognizing the inherent racism within the NGO charity sector. It had 5 overall commitments, and the one that I've put here today is specifically around storytelling, so I think the most relevant for our discussion today. And really, one of the reasons why it was so brave is I think it was the first time that a large NGO has made such a bold statement in this way. So as you can see here, what we've said is we will reconstruct our storytelling, testing whether our fundraising, communications and campaigning work stereotypes others or strips agency and dignity from children. We will remove white saviorism and the white gaze from our communications about our international work and ensure the lived experience of Black families and families of colour in poverty is at the heart of our communications and advocacy about our domestic work. So this went out in June. We are now kind of in the process of working through kind of our action plan, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. But firstly, I also really quickly wanted to just show you as a bit of a taster some of the stories that we've put out recently. Before this statement came out, kind of that we're kind of deconstructing negative stereotypes has always been a really large part of our work. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Lena. So this was a campaign that I wanted to mention really quickly called I Am the Future. Some of you might have seen the TV advert, which came out around September last year. And it was a project that we did where we kind of very directly challenged the audience with their perceptions of stereotypes and children. So you go to the next slide, please, Lena. So there's a few grabs from the TV ad there, and basically the idea was that you would see the TV ad, which consisted of an actress who was looking straight to camera, walking forward, and the scenery was changing behind her, and she basically kind of challenged the audience to ask them what they thought of her. So the script was something along the lines of, look at me, what do you see? Do you see a refugee, a child soldier, a child bride? And the idea was that when you saw the ad, you would then go onto our website and then learn more about the real stories behind the ad. So we covered 6 children, so 5 different stories in total, which you can see there on the right, which really were a deep dive into the individual stories of some of the children where the public may have perceived preconceptions about beforehand. And if you could move on to the next slide, please, Lena. So another story which we put out late last year was about Tina and Maisie, who are 2 brilliant girls who I think they're 17 and 16, who are part of a livelihoods program that we run in South Sudan. There's 9 different vocations that you can enroll into, and these 2 best friends are the first female welders in their village, and they're starting their welding business. They may or may not hire boys, as I mentioned, and we just thought it was such a brilliant story that completely kind of smashed any kind of gender stereotypes in terms of what women could do, what kind of livelihoods or jobs they could do, and that, as you can see from the photos, they were just so engaging. And we made a VR film about them for our centenary last year, and it's been picked up quite a lot. And I think one of the reasons why it's been so popular is because it kind of really challenges our perceptions of women in the global south. And the next slide. We also did, we met some sisters in Jordan. So part of the brand campaign we did where we, that I mentioned earlier with the TV ad with the girl, we met these two sisters called Hiba and Rama, who were at Satari refugee camp living there, Syrian refugees. And we actually decided to go back to them after meeting them first of all. Reason being is that they were girl rappers and they were child marriage activists. So they used to write raps against child marriage. They actually stopped a friend of theirs, they convinced their parents to stop a marriage happening. And we thought it would be amazing if we would give them one of our social platforms. So we did a day of a Hiba and Rama takeover where we gave them selfie sticks, we gave them a brief, we kind of were with them to help them document their lives, and they took over a whole day of our social channels. And again, I think kind of really resonated because it was something quite different, and again, challenged those stereotypes of refugees that you might see. And another story, if we could move on. So this is, the next three are just very quick examples of projects that we've done in the past, which involve our contributors and our participants in retelling of their stories. So one of the things that we are really keen on doing is making sure where we can, where appropriate and where feasible, we are involving the participants in the actual retelling of their stories. And obviously, because we're working with children, the way that they tell us or relay their stories are very creative. So one project we did back in 2016 was to send a photographer called Patrick Willock to Tanzania and Lebanon. He himself grew up in the DRC. And he makes these amazing kind of theatrical landscapes, so actually built, physically built. We spent a couple of weeks in a refugee camp in both Lebanon and Tanzania, where we spoke to children about their experiences. We asked them to draw, to write poems, and we produced 6 kind of scenes, 3 of them you'll see at the top here, which came kind of directly from the children. And then over the course of the next 2 or 3 weeks, the people that living in the camp, so their parents and the children themselves, built these sets and appeared in these sets. So everything, you know, they were very much part of the creative process and the final creative image. The next project is an example of kind of a very sensitive subject where we really wanted to make sure that the participants involved were able to tell their stories in their own way. This was around, this is where we sent a photographer, Delphine Diallo, to a safe house in Senegal, in Dakar, where, which housed kind of women who had children either through sexual violence or early marriage, who were ostracized from their community. So what we did is we ran kind of some creative collage workshops with them. Obviously, with such a sensitive subject, it's quite difficult sometimes for children to express in words what their experiences have been. So we found that using kind of ripped up images from magazines was a much softer and more effective and kind of nurturing way of them being able to retell their stories. So Delphine herself, the photographer who we send, is French Senegalese, who spends half her time in New York as well. She's a kind of a fashion photographer, so quite different from the normal kind of photographers that we use. But she ran this kind of creative workshop with the girls, and you'll see that each of their portraits, the girls have made collages of their stories around their portrait. And the last example is a kind of quite a short, quick project that we did in a refugee camp in Uganda and also in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, where we involved children in taking Polaroids of each other and then drawing their kind of hopes and dreams and thoughts and ideas. We kind of gave them free rein to write whatever they wanted to on their portrait. And we found this, again, a really nice and kind of soft and engaging way for them to open up about their experiences and what their kind of hopes and dreams were. So that was just really to give you a bit of a taster of the kinds of projects that we've done, but just to say that obviously we We've made these commitments quite recently. We're just the beginning of this really long journey, and I'm kind of, really looking forward to trying to answer your questions, or, to discussing further about how we can move forward as an anti-racist organisation. But I think one of the important things is to recognise that, that we won't always get things right, and that we might fail. But yeah, it's a really exciting journey that we've embarked on.
Thanks, Ivy. That's great. There's some amazing creative executions there. So Natalie, could you tell us a bit about yourself?
Hi there. So my name is Natalie Larty. I work in campaigns and content, and I've worked in the environmental and the development sectors for well over 15 years now. I have worked most recently in doing campaigning and creating content on issues linked to food insecurity and nutrition and food crises, which is definitely one of the areas I think has had a track record of kind of critique, I suppose, in relation to how we are representing both white and black people in our storytelling. So that's a little bit about my background. At the moment, I'm working for the International Institute for the Environment and Development. I work on content and advocacy capacity building. I'm also a consultant. I do some training for Bond, and I'm just in the process of setting up some projects with environmental and development organisations and businesses, and actually working with them to help tackle this issue of how to address mis and underrepresentation of black people in our sectors. So before I talk a little bit about the work that I'm doing on this topic with IIED, there were 2 points that I wanted to make, really just to set the scene a little bit. And the first point is about narratives and why narratives are important. I think it's really good to take a moment as a sector to recognise that narratives do have real power. And when we're at our home desks, or we're fresh in our offices thinking about our fundraising content, or our latest lobbying campaign, or communication piece of material, we're always really focused on what we need to say to progress the issues within our mandate, or how we need to fundraise, and the content we create is usually framed by those immediate needs of our organisation. But it is really important to actually lift our head up and take a broader view of narratives and narratives within our sector. So when we talk about narratives across the sector, what we're talking about is that big collection of stories that are told again and again over time through all of our organisations and all of our collected media channels. And so when you have a narrative trope, a similar story that is told literally for decades, it becomes entrenched over time. And what it does is it forges social ideas and beliefs. And that is really where the power lies in a narrative. It's the big collective narratives that we tell over and over again. So I think that's the first point. It's really important to look at our storytelling in relation to our organisations, but we really need to have our head up at a moment like this and think about the power of the narratives socially when they're combined and telling stories over time. So the next point is, why now? Why is it important that we look at our sector narratives right now? I think that lots of people in our sector understand and acknowledge that we're probably a little bit late to the table in addressing this issue of how our narratives are or are not contributing to racism and anti-racism, whichever it may be, and it could always be a mixture of both. Things are never straightforward. But you know, the sense is, in the conversations I'm having, is yes, we are a little bit late to the table. And yes, the Black Lives Matter movement has been a huge trigger for us all collectively. And just to talk on that for a moment, you know, what is it that the Black Lives Matter movement has done for us? I think essentially what's happened is we've all experienced a bit of a shift in awareness and a shift in consciousness. And there is a recognition that when we're looking at our collective narratives as a whole, our normal and our business is normal, our day-to-day kind of conversation that we're having with the public about aid and development is presenting some problems and some challenges. You know, when we look at or think about racism, it's really easy to think about one kind of abhorrent comment or the wayward story that is actually a bit off kilter and is a problem. You know, we think of that ugly thing, but I think what the BLM movement has done for us is allowed us to recognize that it's not this one-off awful thing. There's actually a challenge in our business as usual and our day-to-day, and we're looking back on how we used to communicate and realizing that there are some challenges in business as usual. And I just wanted to quickly sketch out an example of that, just to sit alongside some of the really, you know, wonderful examples that we've just seen on Save the Children. You know, I think if we want to understand how our narratives are really either contributing to racism or anti-racism, it's really good to have a picture of what anti-racism looks like in the way that we've just seen from Save the Children, but also what racism looks like, so that we can assess our content kind of with conscious awareness. So, you know, if you think about maybe a blog and a photo story about a food shortage, could even be a campaign. There might be some key messages in there about aid and British taxpayers and the work that they're doing to fight poverty. There could be some key messages about an aid worker. There could be a celebrity. There could be a petition. And more often than not always, but a lot of the time, those people that are presented as having some power, some knowledge, some goodwill are likely to be white people. Alongside that, we might have a mother and a child. We might have an absent wider family. There may be an absent father. And those people are going to be presented as maybe not having the power to solve their problem, as being reliant on someone else, unable to find a solution. They will be recipients or beneficiaries. And in many instances, those people are likely to be Black and brown people. So I think, you know, we need to acknowledge that, you know, many of the campaigning, the fundraising recipes that we use are based around that type of dynamic. And there are ideas that sit underneath that are part of society. They're not specific to our sector, but they're much broader social ideas about the prominence and kind of skill, dare I even say superiority of white communities, and the disadvantage and vulnerability and powerlessness of Black communities. And so I think where we are at the moment, post BLM, is in this space where we're recognizing, not always and not in every bit of content, but much of the time when we look at the big collective picture of our narrative, we are reinforcing some of these narrative tropes that we hopefully want to transform. You know, there's been lots of talk about us wanting to become anti-racist, and I think narratives is a great place to start with that. So those are just two quick points to kind of put some of the bigger challenges into the picture alongside some of the kind of ways through those those challenges and some of the amazing pathways to change that are being set out by Save the Children and some of the others working in this sector. So just to come to the work that IIED is doing, so we definitely feel that the Black Lives Matter movement has really opened up a great conversation about race that's going across our whole institute, and narratives is just part of that. We are embarking on a piece of work that will help us develop a framework really to understand more about what our narratives are doing in relation to anti-racism on one hand and in relation to racism on the other. At the moment, we have an instinct and an inkling that there will be some problems in what we have said in the past and in our business as usual, but we don't have a clear picture of where we think the main challenges are, where we think our good practice is, and we really want to be able to weed all that out, you know, get to the bottom of where we think we can do better, but where we think we've got really good good examples that we can build on and take forward. So it's a piece of work that is due to start later this year, and it will run into next year. So I'm not able to share any of our findings with you yet. It'll be something that involves some staff, some of our partners, and we're really excited to kind of, you know, get into the nitty gritty of really understanding where we are at as an institute.
Great, thanks so much, Natalie. That's really interesting and important points. Janice, can I just go back to you? Would you be able to tell us a little bit more about the work that you've been doing locally with working with a lot of local suppliers to collect your stories? I thought that was really interesting.
All right, sure thing. Thanks, Kate. So as part of the work that AMREF does and working with a team of global communicators, we are very conscious about ensuring that the stories that we tell portray the communities that we work with in a very authentic manner, and that the stories are inherent to their realities and the dynamics that affect their health outcomes and general well-being. Because AMREF implements its programs in Africa, a lot of the content that we develop for our comms and fundraising comes from Africa. While in some African countries like Kenya, for example, we have communication resource persons who then help to, you know, collect this kind of information from the different programs and different regions. It's not always the case across all African countries. And in instances where that is the case, what we try to do is use shared resources to ensure that we can get this content from places where we do not have comms point persons. Now, one of the things that we've learned, it's one thing to talk about the whole race issue, but when you look at African communities, there are different dynamics based on nationality. Different nations have different interests, different situations, and different communities and cultures. So I think the biggest lesson for us at AMREF has been being conscious that Africa, one, is not one big country. We have different countries with different dynamics. And within those countries, we have different people of different cultures, people who behave and act a certain way because it's a cultural norm that then tends to affect their health outcomes and their general well-being. And our approach, even in our programming, is looking at them, is not castigating them for those cultural practices, but then saying to them that this particular, we'll give an example of female genital mutilation, for example. It's something that has been practiced by many African communities, and it's part of their culture. Yes, we come in and say that that kind of practice is detrimental to the health and well-being of young girls and women, but then work with them to find culturally appropriate alternatives to that practice that takes away the harmful elements, but then maintains the aspects of the culture that are actually good and serve the communities and have been serving the communities historically. So we apply the same principle to the comms that we produce, because in our messaging, it has to speak to the issue of health as a human right, and therefore anything that then tends to curtail that the access to that that right is what we focus on, but not castigating the communities for some of their practices. And what we've learned is that it's really, really useful to work with people who understand the cultural dynamics of these communities, who understand, for example, that in some communities, it will not be possible to get men and women to sit together to share insights, or to, you know, when you're filming a documentary, that you'll have to put some of these things in mind and in context when you're preparing to develop a comms product. So what we've done at AMREF is, in the most recent past, we really tried to build on the use of local expertise from our respective African countries to be the people who go out to the field to collect these stories. So we have the capacity to some extent within the shared communication function, but sometimes it's not always possible to have someone from the team go to the field. So we'll outsource those services. And we found it very, very useful to use, if it's a story that's being featured from Kenya, that we use a Kenyan photographer, a Kenyan filmmaker, someone who understands the cultural nuances and the dynamics of that particular community, to have them go to the community and then capture these stories. It has really helped because it helps us to manage the relationship that we have with these communities, but also to ensure that the products that we get are really, again, authentic and telling the story of these communities that we work with. I think a big challenge that we've had in the past has been because of the resources that are allocated to the comms function. And I think many of us who are communicators can appreciate that comms does not always get the kind of resourcing that it needs, both in terms of human resource, but well as the money and the budget. So we've relied on our offices in Europe and North America to provide some of those resources for us. And sometimes it's meant sending over photographers or filmmakers from that part of the world to come and channel some of these stories. And while we've often produced great comms products, sometimes the things that happen in the field are things that have long-term effects because we have people who are either not adequately briefed, so therefore they don't understand some of these things. And we've really found this way of working as a way of navigating that issue. That way we are building local expertise. We are also elevating it by giving these people an opportunity to have their work featured on a global platform. And at the same time ensuring that we maintain the relationship that we have with these communities that's critical to the work that we are doing. Yeah.
Great, thank you. That's really useful. And we've got a question later on how can organisations work towards better representation. So that working with local suppliers is potentially a solution for that. So something that Natalie, you touched on quite a lot, but you might have more to say. So we wanted to ask each of you how you feel INGO communications and fundraising activity contribute to the narrative around race, and what is your view on the current representation in INGO comms and fundraising? So Janice, I'll start with you. Why do you think it's so important that INGOs look at their fundraising and comms activity from a perspective of contributing to a race narrative? Oh, you're on mute, sorry.
My apologies. So I think the first step is looking at opportunities to elevate African expertise, because in our different markets, we have, especially for an organization like AMREF that works in Africa, it's an African-led organization that is addressing the issues that affect the African communities. And we have subject matter experts who are African, who are very well versed on some of these issues. And therefore, when we're looking at comms and fundraising opportunities and products, it is essential that we have that authentic voice being what we showcase, and speaking to the reality of what is actually happening on the context. So that's one thing. The other issue is around the honesty and transparency that comes about by looking at African issues from the lens of an African, from an African's perspective, because you'll find that these community voices are not, yes, only authentic, but many of these communities actually have the solutions that they need to live a better life, to actually change the narrative. And unless we provide this opportunity for them to showcase this and share those insights, then development will be an endless pool where resources are pumped in, but then we do not have sustainable outcomes. So then it becomes important to ensure that those people are very adequately represented in identifying the problems, identifying the solutions, and being given a platform to speak about them and showcase that, and also the support that they would need to actually sustain that kind of change.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And for organisations who perhaps don't have the same processes in place that you do yet, what do you think are the dangers of telling inauthentic stories about the communities that you work in?
Yeah, there are challenges around, number one, language. That's probably not culturally sensitive. That could be an issue. And then, of course, something like what Ivy showed us earlier in her imagery, using images that are not consistent with the story on the ground. And there are so many opportunities that are available because organizations like AMREF avail some of these materials and this information, and then it becomes important to work in partnership with organizations such as AMREF and others working within Africa to get some of these stories and some of this content. I'll give you an example of something that we are doing within one of the programs that we have around the issue of using participatory video. So we have a group of young people who have been trained. They are former street children who have then been gone through the process of rehabilitation and have been equipped with the skills to produce video, photography, and documentaries and the like. So those are people who are resources within the country who understand the environment and they understand the context in which we work, and their resources that can be used by organizations that don't necessarily have access to, to African communities to that extent. And those are entities that would be happy to have them offer support to organizations that would need that kind of resource and that kind of support. So there are those opportunities, and anybody who might be interested can feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to make that connection. But working and platforms such as this as well, where people can come and talk about the work that they're doing and identify who has boots on the ground and who can help us deliver some of these things will be really, really essential.
Thank you. And Ivy, how do you think NGO communications and fundraising contribute to narratives around race?
I mean, there's no getting away from the fact that kind of fundraising by its very nature has this inherent power imbalance. And so the stories that we tell, as whether you're a smaller NGO or a much larger one like Save the Children, the stories that we tell, there's no getting away from the fact that the way that we tell them will affect public perception of that particular community or family or child. So, the kind of power that we have is so it's so strong, and we have such a responsibility to make sure that we are not only deconstructing stereotypes and making sure that we are not kind of perpetuating tokenism or negative perceptions, but actually forming positive perceptions on communities of the global south or other marginalized communities. So it's really quite problematic, and I think as charities, as INGOs, we should admit the problematic nature that exists in the very kind of core of our fundraising practices. And in terms of the question around kind of what is the current state of representation, I think actually it's getting much better, and there's a few reasons for that. I think audiences are becoming, are much more sophisticated, and they want authentic stories. They engage with and they respond to authentic first person stories, which is really brilliant, because that's where we want to be. We want to be in a place where we are putting children's voices at the forefront of all of our comms, so that we are in effect removing ourselves and just being the platform for our storytellers to relay their stories and what's important to them, not necessarily what fits into a marketing narrative or an agenda that we might have, which is quite a difficult thing to do, and in itself is quite problematic. And I think another thing which is relatively new and a new challenge is kind of how media and comms are consumed now. So, we're seeing much more kind of short, snappy, digital, quite often, relaying of stories. So how do you avoid telling that single story? How do you avoid being reductive in your storytelling and only telling a very tiny part of a whole person's life in a 30-second or 10-second social media video or GIF or still image with one quote? That's a challenge that we have on a daily basis, and one of the things that we think about a lot and are working through, is it that we make sure that there's access to the wider 360 story somewhere for the person to delve deeper, and actually those kind of short, sharp snippets, we know that audiences have very short attention spans. Do we treat them just like hooks in terms of enticing and intriguing our audiences to learn more, but in fact the wider story is there? So it's a really fascinating and interesting time, and I think not devoid of many different challenges and different nuances in terms of how our storytellers are represented. I think the best approach is, and certainly kind of how we are trying to approach things, is to really consider everything we can, make sure we are kind of in the spirit of collaboration with not just comms teams, but our program teams on the ground, as Janice mentioned, kind of relying very heavily on our field staff who are in these communities, who are from these communities, and taking their lead as to what might be appropriate or not, and kind of slowly but surely making sure that we are kind of moving forward in the right way. And as I mentioned before, it's not to say that we won't fail or that we won't take the wrong turn now or now and then, but I think having the broader approach, as Natalie mentioned, kind of putting your head above the parapet and just having a look around is a really important way to start.
Thank you. And Natalie, you talked a bit about the sort of the real power of narratives. What's your perception of current representation across the communications and fundraising you see?
Thanks, Kate. I think that just building on the points from the other panelists, it is important to acknowledge the progress that we've made so far. And I think that there is definitely a sea change happening that means that the stories that we tell at the moment are honouring the people within the stories. We're telling stories with much more dignity, we're telling stories with more creativity, and there's more co-creation, particularly in communications. And all of that is part of a broader forward motion. Where I'd like us to go next is to get clearer on changing the fundamental idea underneath the story. So at the moment, there are things that are missing from the ideas that we are sharing around development. For example, we know that much of the storytelling around access to education or access to health is not yet telling the story of how segregation or apartheid or colonialism has affected access to health and education for families all over African and Southeast Asian countries. There's a huge gap in how we are telling stories about why access to education and why access to health is so problematic. I mentioned earlier that that the first respondents in a food crisis, for example, is often the household itself, then the wider community, and then the broader diaspora of that community through migration, for example, and extended families sending money home. We know that if you follow that money train, you will find out that actually Black people help Black people get out of poverty equally or more so than white people helping Black people get out of poverty. And so this fundamental idea that gets shared through our stories that Black people are quite passive recipients of aid, essentially, and that is how poverty gets eradicated, is, I think, the next frontier and the next idea that needs to be challenged. You know, we know when we follow the money and we look at evidence that actually there's a wealth of stories that need to be told about, as I said, Black people helping themselves through the diaspora. We need to tell stories about why we have this huge inequality in the first place. We need to, rather than just look at poverty, look at the global patterns of poverty, look at exploitation. So I think, yes, we've moved a long way and we tell stories with great dignity, but there are huge gaps in our storytelling. And I think that's probably the next frontier for us.
Thank you. That leads us nicely on to our next question about how we can work towards better representation. But it's really interesting to hear sort of the wider story that, you know, I feel like I work in development and feel like I'm quite knowledgeable, but I feel very ignorant about the stories that you're talking about. So how do you think organizations can start to tell this story? And you sort of talked before about, you know, the mandate that each organization has, or how can we combine our individual mandates with sort of telling this wider story?
I think
big problem I'm asking you to solve there.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of places to start. I think this conversation, I think that if there is a drive from a number of charities, big, medium-sized and small, to all really transform storytelling, there's definitely an opportunity to share our experiences on this journey and to come together once we've made some progress and think collectively about the impact of our joined up storytelling. I think, you know, there's definitely some moments where those organisations that are making the start on this should come together and think about joining the dots a little bit. I think that's one thing that would be really interesting and exciting and useful. I think that having more storytelling happening in African and South Asian and Latin American countries in the way that AMREF have described is a crucial part of the problem. That needs to transform. I also think having much more diversity and Black and Asian minority ethnic representation within development organisations in Britain is key. You know, if you have more Black and brown people as the fundraising director, or as the CEO, or as your picture editor, there will be more people who are saying, you know what, that image or that idea within the image is not appropriate anymore and we need to do something differently. So I think those are three places that we can start, you know, coming together, analysing our narrative, sharing, progress on one hand, I think doing our content generation in the countries, co-creating with the people we work with is a second, and then having much more diversity within our own workforces is a third.
Thank you. That's fantastic. And Janice, what do you think that organisations can do? Like you've made a big move in this direction, and it's working really well for you. If an organisation was sort of several years back in the process and wanted to take a move towards this, like what advice would you give them?
Thanks, Kate. So for a start, I think there's a need to, in terms of process internally, one of the things we've had to do and be very clear about, which is a process that we've recently just concluded, is issues around outlining what our being very clear about what our safeguarding measures are, and also dynamics around image consent. I think that would be a good place to start. And when thinking through that is to say that, of course, the communities are at the heart of the work that we do, but we need to ensure that we protect them even as we use imagery from their unique settings to fundraise or to tell the African story. But then how empowered are they to know that, for example, an image, they have a choice, for example, not to agree to a certain picture being taken of them, and that they can see what that product looks like. And that would be a good place to start the conversation with these communities that we work with. So for us, we've had to very clearly develop an image consent policy that we did not have before, that helps us to think through, who do we want to feature? What kind of images are we looking at? Where can they be found? Do we have a connection with these communities? And if not, how can we establish that kind of connection? And once we have this imagery, what's the process? How do we involve the communities in giving us feedback about what we are sharing about them, but also how long are we going to use these images? Because I think that's also something else that we do not think through. What's the shelf life? And once you agree on those things within the organization, then you'll find that it's a lot easier to think through the different steps and the processes that you need to follow to finally have a product that is powerful, that communicates, but that also honors the rights of the communities that we work with. So I think for organizations that do not have these things in place, that would be a good place to start.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point about involving the communities themselves and feeding back on the content that we share about them, because we can sit here as sort of development professionals, or particularly UK based, and talk about it all day long, but it really matters what people think about how they're being portrayed themselves. Ivy, you've given us some really great examples of what SAVE are doing in terms of your creative. Is there anything else that you think that you would recommend that organisations can look at to move towards better representation?
I think it's quite interesting. I found that sometimes within NGO charity work that we're quite scared to talk about progress, and I wonder whether us talking about the progress that the world has made in tackling many of the issues is one way of building a positive picture. I mean, and I feel that sometimes we are scared to talk about the positive things that have happened, or involving the audience in being part of that positive change by showing the progress, and instead of going straight towards outlining the need. So that might be one way that we could kind of build a better representation. I think also maybe another way is kind of just telling many different stories. So as Natalie mentioned right at the beginning, not perpetuating this kind of large entrenched narrative, but kind of challenging the status quo and telling the wonderful myriad of stories that are out there, which might not fit into our ideas of the communities that are outside of our own. And I don't see that as problematic in terms of the connection with the viewer. I think you can tell a very niche, different story. It's how you tell it. if you make it emotive and really kind of from the heart and really kind of in depth and honest and authentic, I still think you can make that connection with your donor or your supporter, even though it's a very, you know, niche, very different story, or any kind of from any of the set of circumstances that they might have in their lives. So that kind of breadth of experience, I think, would help dismantle the kind of old clunky narratives that have developed in the charity sector. So it's kind of like unlearning the ways that we communicate and broadening them out. And I think another thing is potentially that, I mean, not necessarily outward facing, but I think something that would help organisations kind of move forward in terms of better representation is to be really honest with themselves about a potential kind of audience drop, engagement drop, or fundraising income hit, because you know, as we move through this process and we test and learn what resonates with audiences, but also they will be quite different potentially from what they've seen before, and that might in turn result in a fundraising drop in donations. And so if organizations are very honest about and prepared to take that hit, and also to resource this kind of new way of communicating, I think we'll be in a much better place to actually make proactive and positive steps forward.
Thank you. I think we've got quite a lot of questions waiting in the Q&A. Jess, I think if you're able to pick a couple out, we've got half an hour, so hopefully we'll be able to get through quite a few. But I think you've been monitoring them.
Yeah, I have. Thanks everyone for your really thoughtful and interesting questions, and thanks panelists for the discussion so far. It's been great. I've tried to sort of group them into chunks because there are a lot. One that, and then I've kind of given them a little rating in terms of how many commentary we've had on different kind of areas. So I'll start off by, we've had a lot of questions about whether this new way of communicating, and I think people are thinking especially about the kind of example that you shared, Ivy, whether it when you are working in maybe a more participatory way or in a fuller more way with your with the contributors of the stories. Questions around whether that works for fundraising, and kind of assumptions that that's working well for engagement but not so much for fundraising. Now I know some of those projects worked really well for fundraising because I was working at Save at the time, but Ivy, why don't you talk a little bit about the kind of ROI of those types of projects from a fundraising perspective?
Yeah, sure, that's a really good question, and I think it's a question that comes up quite a lot with those more kind of comms or creative heavy projects where potentially we might take creative risks. And obviously when it comes to fundraising, you know, we have to be very careful in those kinds of risks, creative risks that we take, because we don't want to negatively affect any income that comes in. So I'd say, I mean, a lot of the projects that I showed did have a very kind of the ROIs were very engagement heavy, and we did get a lot of media coverage. But for example, with the Patrick Willock project, kind of off the back of I think the original launch was around the World Humanitarian Day, which was the first summit in 2016. So we got lots of media coverage, but off the back of that, it was kind of a project that ran and ran and ran. And so we found that it was originally produced by SC UK, but we found that many of our membership kind of retold that story, did lots of exhibitions in their own countries. There was an exhibition held in Lebanon as well. And that in turn kind of, maybe not in the mass market space so much in terms of fundraising, but, you know, prints were sold, and there was lots of awareness raised about it. There was, yeah, so I mean, so I think those kinds of projects have a propensity to have a longer shelf life almost, because they are so intriguing, and because that particular creative route was so easily digestible and so different, it kind of worked across all of our global markets. So it really kind of translated wherever you were. And I remember we were invited to the UNGA to exhibit that project, and you know, lots of policymakers, and I think the Prime Minister of Norway approached us and said that she had never seen refugees kind of depicted in that way. So I think for that particular project, not so much mass fundraising, but kind of the offshoots and the longevity was a real success. The other ones, with the brand campaign, right? So with the very first example I showed, I mean, that was a broadcast campaign. So that worked very well in fundraising. Obviously, it was given a lot of airtime, and we found that the kind of the rate of people that went from the ad to our website to then donate was quite high. I don't have the exact figures, but we found that in all of that halo content, that people kind of stayed on the website for longer than they would normally. I think because hopefully they found a link between seeing the advert and the individual real stories, and had the opportunity to delve into those stories, which obviously had the donate function as well on that halo content on the kind of main website that you went to. So it felt quite seamless that you'd start from the TV advert, which didn't have a fundraising ask on it, but we did see people go through the process and then donate on the website later on.
Thanks for explaining all of that. I think, and one of the other questions we've had a lot, which I'll throw to you, Janice, is around how you bring your partners on board in terms of ethical working when it may take more time, it may take more effort, and then how you do that in a way that makes sure that you also get the quality content back that you need. There's quite a few people saying, you know, I'm a small organisation, I work loads with my partners, but the stuff I get back isn't really it isn't of the quality we need it to be. And how do you make sure that you're working in that way with your partners? So Janice, I'll throw that to you because you've been talking a little bit about that.
All right. Thanks, Jess. So what we've tried to do is, at the point at which we are onboarding partners for any of our work, we take them through some comms training. Some partners we acknowledge will already have resources that they can leverage to deliver on the work. But for those that do not have that, we make it very intentional that we take them as part of their induction and part of the project inceptions and things like that. We take them through comms training, where we walk them through what our policies are in regards to safeguarding, but also as relates to ethical use of imagery and storytelling. Then we work hand in hand with them to develop this content that they can always call on us. Sometimes we provide the resources ourselves for them to deliver on some of these outputs. And when that is not possible, what we've done is we ensure that this content then comes back to us for any kind of critique. And if we have feedback, we share that. So then it becomes a continuous learning process. And we've seen that working. But around the issue to do with resources as well, we recently had a partnership with Canon where it was sort of a shared value partnership where they availed some of their equipment to us on the basis that we acknowledge that any imagery or any products that were produced, that we acknowledge that this has been produced using this Canon piece of equipment and that kind of thing. And we've seen that has worked. I think there's an opportunity for us to leverage that kind of partnership, demonstrating shared value for the business, but also for us in working in the development areas. That we can leverage some of those opportunities to ensure that our partners have the right equipment. And when you have partners like Canon on board, for example, then they'll ensure that these people are trained and then you will see some kind of shift in the quality of products that come. But it really has to do with being intentional about providing that technical support and walking the journey with them, so that then we get the kind of products that we need.
That's really interesting. Thank you. So yeah, you do need to invest time and effort from the start to yield back what you need for your work. Natalie, I'm going to throw the next question to you, which is, how do you? I mean, there's lots of talk around the NGO sector needing to change, and kind of recognition that a lot of what's happening right now isn't kind of, isn't best practice and isn't what should be happening. But how do you, as an, if you're working for an organisation right now, how do you identify what is inappropriate in the way that you work, both in terms of the kind of processes and the portrayal of what you're saying?
Hi, thanks, Jess. So I think it's a new area, and so I'd say up front that there's probably no quick fixes or right ways to start identifying what the challenges are and where the challenges are. What I can say is that I think having cross-organisational teams where you're pulling expertise from different parts of your organisation that can help you work this out is important. So, for example, at IAD, there's a small project team that we've pulled together to help us take on that very task. We've got somebody from communications, myself, somebody that understands around narratives and narrative assessment. We've also got somebody from our strategy learning group that understands about evaluations and putting together robust frameworks and tools that can give us kind of some kind of systematic methodological rigor as we kind of go through and analyze our content. And so I think it's about doing your research, talking internally, either finding or creating some type of systematic tool that you can use to assess your narratives, and to then kind of be really aware of a couple of things. So some of the things that we will be taking into consideration is the fact that a narrative will be perceived quite differently in different parts of the world. So if you have a narrative and you take that to Niger, where maybe there are not the same type of issues as racism that you have in London, you're taking it to a majority black country rather than a majority white country. So all of the perceptions and the biases and the ideas that people bring to that bit of content when they look at it are going to be really different. So while you can put a method together and you can create a tool, you also have to have some awareness that this is an art, not a science. And so using focus groups, having lots of different people who live in different places and have different views come and look at that content and bring their perspective, and then taking the sum of those discussions and using that to come to your kind of initial insights and ideas about your content is going to be really important. So those are just a couple of things that I think we've been doing. I think it is worth saying, having people in your organisation who have a kind of technical understanding of race and racism is really important. We've heard a lot about kind of black staff in organisations up and down the country all being pulled into conversations about race and racism just because of their blackness, but being black doesn't always qualify you to really understand the ins and outs of racism, what it is, how it works at a systematic level. So kind of having people who have that experience be part of your team, I think, is also really important. If I can just take the liberty, Jess, I really wanted to jump in on this question about fundraising.
Yeah, go for it.
So with fundraising, I really think that there could be a sweet spot for fundraising. I hate the thoughts that that there's no answer, or we're going to have to lose huge amounts of revenue, or not get the right returns on our investments for fundraising as we kind of tackle this big issue of representation. And I think for fundraising, the one thing that I would say is that a good starting point is to actually reassess who your donor is. You know, lots of fundraising teams work on this idea of having a like donor. You know, we recruit more donors that look like the donors that we already have. And because of that, we don't actually have much racial diversity within our mix of donors. And I think if there's a place where fundraisers want to take a risk, right about now, I think that risk could be recognizing that there are donors in Britain that come from different racial groups that you have not identified yet. And if you do identify them, you will then know that you're going to have to create content that will engage your new donor that might be from a different racial group, as well as your ongoing like donor. And once you start creating content for fundraising that is inclusive of all racial groups rather than exclusive of some racial groups, which I think, my instinct is a challenge at the moment. A lot of the fundraising content puts people of colour off. If you can start creating content for fundraising that's inclusive of all racial groups, because you believe there are people of colour in this country that will donate to your organisation, you are halfway towards transforming your content from a fundraising perspective.
That's a really important point, and thanks for jumping in on that one. I should also add that, I mean, even for your like donors, there's ways to change the way you work. When I was content director at Save the Children, and working with Ivy on this, we changed our DRTV from a kind of parade of context-free suffering children to little mini documentaries that are like 1.5 minute documentaries, which still did a lot of what DRTV needs to do, but did it in a really, really different way from the films before, and still brought in enough money. And it did take a few years and a lot of testing and learning.
A lot of testing, test, absolutely.
Yeah. But we did it. And it was a real priority, and we did it. So there are ways to do that. Thank you. All right, so I'm just gonna. I think one of the things that we've heard a lot about in the questions is around the idea of, you know, the kind of some of the practical ways that we can start telling news stories in terms of involving our contributors, or beneficiaries as they're often called, term I'm not very keen on. And so Ivy, I wanted to just throw to you and say, do you think participatory image making is a way to solve those problems, and how challenging are those projects to kind of set up and expensive? But could you also, people think a lot about participatory image making as, you know, getting a camera and giving it to a child, and it's much broader than that. So could you just expand on that topic a little bit? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I guess when we talk about participatory content gathering, there's, you know, a huge spectrum in terms of how the contributor can participate. So it goes all the way from, you know, making sure that you have an expert interviewer who, for example, in our case, has experience working and interviewing children, to having a brilliant translator who potentially could be from their community, might be female if appropriate, so that, you know, as we're conducting that interview, you're doing it through somebody who really knows the nuance and the cultural sensitivities. And then the participation in that instance would be where we kind of have quite a lot of emphasis on the contributor leading the conversation. So obviously we'll have a list of questions that we want to ask that might answer a particular fundraising or marketing narrative, but well, I found in my experience anyway, that kind of those real nuggets of kind of engaging moments or quotes where the contributor really feels comfortable to share their story, which might take some time in the interviewing process, are always the ones that you don't expect, always come from the questions that you didn't write down or that you didn't prepare for. And so kind of being really participant led in that way is, I guess, you know, like one of the first steps where the interview can be led by the storyteller. And then it can range, you know, all the way through to, as we saw in some of the slides before, kind of workshopping or training children in cameras or poetry or drawing, spending time with them, talking about their experiences and how to kind of put that on a piece of paper, or you know, maybe they are not confident in writing or drawing, maybe it's more speaking, or sometimes it can be through dance or drumming, or so I think it's really about finding what's what works and what's appropriate for that particular subject and that for that particular community. And then, I mean, you know, in terms of the facilitators for that participation, I think that's really important as well. So you know, in the examples I showed you, they were external kind of named photographers, but that's very much the kind of rarer end. It's much more the case where we would work very closely with our local comms staff in terms of taking their lead with what kind of workshopping approaches have worked with this community before, how we have engaged them in our child-friendly spaces previously. So these are spaces that we have in refugee camps or communities where we provide educational or psychosocial support. Kind of what kind of creative or storytelling kind of routes have they worked with before? What do they feel comfortable with? So I think it's really kind of on a case-by-case basis, thinking about, you know, what you want to say about the subject from the NGO perspective, but then really thinking about that community or that family, and then just taking their lead in essence, and making sure that you leave space in your brief to be open, to be led to a place that you might not expect. And for me, that's the sweet spot in terms of creative content and authentic storytelling. And as I mentioned before, in my experience, that's always when you get something so engaging, so brilliant, a quote which is kind of a golden quote that can be used across everything, that you just didn't imagine in 100 years that you would get something that was so pertinent potentially, or that was so kind of strikes at the heart of our donors. And I think it's having that openness is really important, but also the expertise when especially working with children, when you're workshopping with them, because obviously when we ask questions, as we all know, you know, there is that propensity to re-traumatize. You know, you're bringing up situations, you're asking questions about sensitive subjects in someone's life. So you really need to make sure that it's in the hands of people that know what they're doing.
Thank you, Ivy. We only have 3 minutes left, and we had lots of other questions, and one comment saying Natalie for president. But I'll just a couple of there's one question which I'll quickly jump in and say. Someone asked, have we ever sought feedback from the story owners to the narratives that we present of them? And so the people in the pictures research that was mentioned at the start did that on the largest scale that has been done. But I have recently published a paper which wraps up all of the research where people have done that, which is only a paltry 8 pieces of research. But I will post a link to that in the chat now, so you guys can have a look at that if you want to. But yes, there has been research. That was my research specialism. I'm going to hand back to Kate now, just to wrap things up for the day. But yeah, thanks from me for everyone and everything. It was a really wonderful talk. But Kate, I'll hand back to you to wrap up.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. Thanks for all your brilliant questions. I've done a screen grab of all the questions, actually. So we're going to look at how we can sort of summarise this conversation, because I think there's some really useful and constructive advice, and some really interesting areas that I for one definitely want to go away and educate myself a little bit more on. So if when we look at the questions we feel that there's some important ones that haven't been answered, then we'll try and do that in the way that we feedback as well. So as I mentioned at the start, the webinar has been recorded and we're aiming to do a blog. And if sort of this is something that you're interested in, or you work a lot on sort of representation and content production and content collection in your role, then please do join us in the People in the Pictures group. We're going to have regular meetings to sort of talk about the challenges and things that we want to accomplish. But most of all, just a massive thank you to our brilliant panelists. All three of you have been really, really great and really inspiring. I've had some messages already saying how much people have learned and really want to find out more. So hopefully you've sparked a lot of interest in a lot of people, and we'll start to see some of those changes across the sector. And we'll look out for ways to continue the conversation as well. So huge thanks to everyone, and thanks for joining. I hope you found it useful. Take care. We'll be in touch. Thank you.